All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Morgan Crossman. I'm the Executive Director for Building Bright Futures, and it's my honor to welcome all of you to today's Early Childhood Grand Rounds seminar. For those of you who have not joined us for Grand Rounds, we see this Early Childhood Grand Rounds forum as a way to convene for Building Bright Futures to really think about how we elevate and disseminate high quality early childhood data or any data related topics that we as a state are grappling or that are impacting kids and families, and really using it as a place to talk about data challenges that we're facing, national best practice, and use it really as a sounding board, as a roundtable discussion with key partners across sectors. So, really excited to have you all here today. We have about 37 people in the room now, over 70 people registered. So, we'll keep having folks come into the room. But today's session is going to be focused on data privacy in early childhood systems that we have in the state of Vermont. And we'll talk about some of the competing priorities, the trade-offs, and hear some perspectives of leaders across a few different sectors. Before I introduce our panelists that we're thrilled to have, I just want to give you a quick outline of today's seminar. So if we can throw up our slide share. The first thing that I will do is provide a little bit of a background on Building Bright Futures and do a really brief orientation to where Vermont's Early Childhood Strategic Plan prioritizes data-driven decision making, and really thinking about our expectations and how to use data in a safe way. We're also going to then hear from three experts in a roundtable discussion. And what you'll hear from them is what they are currently working on in data safety and privacy, their roles, hopefully do some myth busting around some of the key questions that we all have around early childhood data. So that roundtable is going to start by having 5 to 10 minutes for each of our speakers to talk a little bit about that work and where they sit. And then we'll do a 30-minute facilitated roundtable discussion. And what I want to call out for everyone on the call today is that we're not looking to have this beautiful resolution of exactly what is coming next or how we're going to move or solve every challenge in the data privacy or the data safety space. The purpose is to really push each other's thinking, to ask questions of each other, and really hear how we're thinking about the trade-offs around what's important related to high quality data and where it can be really challenging and sometimes harmful. And what I'm really proud of with this group of panelists is their willingness to sit in this space with us and actually name where it's really complicated and talk through and problem solve. So our ultimate goal today is to have this roundtable discussion to really help our policymakers and systems leaders think more about the trade-offs related to security, data safety, and privacy. And throughout today's session, I want to encourage you to pose questions to our panelists in the chat as you're hearing them, and we'll be documenting them. But then you can also ask questions and be a part of that discussion a little later on. In terms of today's session, as I mentioned, it's going to be recorded, and I want to ask that everyone who is not part of the panel turn off their cameras and mute yourselves as we're starting the session. And once we get into that discussion and the question and answer, we'll invite you to turn your cameras back on for that portion. In the meantime, I'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat, name, your role, your organization. Are you a parent of a young child under the age of 8, and where in the state you are calling in from? Next slide, please. So to kick off today's session, really brief overview for those of you who don't generally attend Building Bright Futures meeting to what our role is in the system. We are named as Vermont's Early Childhood State Advisory Council and we've been established in statute as the primary advisor to Vermont's governor, the administration, and the legislature on the well-being of children and families prenatal to age 8. We're a nonpartisan public-private partnership that is bringing together agency leaders, legislators, community members, and family members to help guide a coordinated early childhood system. So the bullets that you're seeing on the screen right now are by statute our responsibilities. So again, that primary role to advise and be that voice to help convene and elevate voice from families, communities, providers, so that we're having real experiences alongside data shape decision making. We also hold the vision and strategic plan for Vermont's early childhood system. So we are responsible for bringing partners together to set that direction, but then also to monitor and understand where we are, understanding the needs, the challenges, and making sure that we're able to turn that data and research into actionable guidance back to that first advised charge. The last two are around ensuring accountability. So, how do we actually know whether our laws, our policies, our systems, our investments are working, and to be able to flag where changes are needed on behalf of the system? And to do that work well, bringing partners together and aligning their work to build capacity across all of these agencies to really think about strengthening that system. So, if you think about our role in the system, that primary charge is to advise, but then there's so many different ways that we are supporting that direct data informed advisement to those decision makers. Next slide, please. So, the last thing I want to talk about related to Building Bright Futures role is the early childhood strategic plan. So, as I mentioned, we're responsible for setting that vision and that direction. And that takes place through a 5 year strategic plan cycle. And so, we just published the next iteration of Vermont's early childhood strategic plan. It's called the Vermont Early Childhood Strategic Plan 2030. And in terms of grounding the conversation today, just want to name that there is a very robust section in this strategic plan around how we have coordinated, well-resourced, data-driven systems that are centering children and families. And so specific to the data elements, this plan's calling for data systems that are responsive, agile, compatible, and working together, that they're equitable, and that they're secure, and that all of our data governance structures are built on, consent and understanding on behalf of those providing their data, and transparency and culturally responsive safeguards. And so today's session for early childhood grand rounds is really to have a conversation about accountability, being really honest about where that's working well and where we're living up to this commitment, and how we have a discussion about how to do this differently and move forward given where we are right now. So before we transition off this slide, one of the reasons that we have had so many discussions and decided that this was the right topic for early childhood grand rounds is very much so the result of so much hard work from our data and evaluation committee that monitors the data sections of the strategic plan. But it's also coming from what we know and don't know on behalf of children and families. We know we need really strong data to know whether our investments in kids and families are working, who's being reached, and who's being left out, and that we need to protect that data, that information that's making our understanding possible. And the challenge right now is that we are in a space where sometimes collecting that information can put families at risk who are most vulnerable to harm. And how do we sit in the tension of both of those things being true? The need for high quality data to both support and understand our investments, and to do that in the most meaningful way that isn't burdensome and that really is supporting our families and people who are collecting and providing that data. So again, not looking for clean resolution today. Our job is to think clearly about what those trade-offs are. And unfortunately, it's not a theoretical conversation in this moment. We have families who are making real decisions about whether or not to access services based on fear of how their data might be used, whether they should access services because they're not sure whether or not it puts their family in jeopardy for some harm. And so when we're seeing families disengage, we're seeing children lose access to services that support their development. So we're not talking about abstract things. We're talking about real world situations right now. And how do we do this better? How do we support families? How do we protect our data? And how do we make decisions based on that data? So again, in terms of the strategic plan, when we're talking about data equity, what we're talking about is ensuring our information is accurately and fairly representing all children and families, and making sure that we have safeguards in place, especially when we're seeing, the communities who are most likely to be harmed by data misuse being those same communities that may be most underrepresented in our data. And so how do we sit in that? So again, as we're thinking about the current moment and the importance of the Grand Round session today, we're collecting so much incredible data on behalf of kids, families, and vulnerable populations. And we're doing that with the best intent, right? To understand what they have access to, how our services impacting their lives. However, if that data can, in certain situations, be used for surveillance or is challenging in the wrong hands or doesn't have the right protections, what does that mean for risk? And so how do we sit with that? And how can we learn from our panelists and each other today? So now I'm going to transition to introducing our three panelists. And we were very intentional around bringing panelists who have completely different, distinct lenses. Some are around technology and systems infrastructure, some are coming from a space of consumer protection, privacy law, or economic security for families. And so, what you're going to hear about today is them talking through and discussing state data practices, how they're thinking about privacy and protection, where data really is critical in understanding systems of service and where there are challenges and what opportunities we should be thinking about. So I'm going to do our brief introduction and then give each speaker 5 to 10 minutes to talk about their role, their work in this area, do a couple of myth busters if you'd like. And we're going to start with Monique Priestley, who is Vermont representative from Um, Orange 2 district and the vice chair of our House Joint Information Technology and Oversight Committee. Monique and I did the Vermont Leadership Institute together. So for those of you who are VLI alums, 2020, best class ever. Our second panelist is Julie Lowell from Public Assets, and her role is coming from Economic Security Policy and Outreach Director. And then we have the Secretary for the Agency of Digital Services, Denise Riley Hughes. So Monique, I'd love to kick it off with you and have you do 5 to 10 minutes about your work, your role in the legislature, and how you're thinking about data safety and data privacy.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure, Morgan. Go first.
No pressure.
No, thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I guess like maybe I'll do a few things just as far as framing of a few kind of big bills that probably people have heard about that were what's been done, kind of what we're working on now, and then maybe a little bit of like where tension might be, like Morgan said, and then how folks, I like to end on how folks can get involved, and I'll answer questions later too. But in 2018, I think given the landscape of everything that's happening federally and the discussions in the news, like data privacy and artificial intelligence has been hitting the news more frequently. And I think if when we had discussions a year ago, and we asked the average person about privacy or data privacy, it was not necessarily a topic that people were even kind of knew how to engage in. And I think in today's world, flash forward a year from just like even to now, people generally have some kind of thought, whether that's I'm worried about my kids using technology at school. I'm worried about my kids using technology at home. I'm worried about the amount of data that's being collected on my kids and my family and how that's being used and how it's being protected and who gets access to it. If it's vulnerable, if it's affecting decisions, whether that's given everything that's going on with profiles being created on people, and especially dangerous for kids from an early age up through adulthood, that could affect whether or not they qualify for a mortgage based on data that's been collected on them, whether or not they get into the school they want to get into, whether or not the prices of groceries and airline tickets and even their future Lyft rides will be different than their peers based on the profiles that are being built on them, from a very, very early age. And I think but one thing that Vermont did really early, and well, not early, but a couple years ago, before we get into data privacy discussions, is in 2018, we had our first data broker registry, which means that data brokers are entities that are selling third parties that are selling people's data. So it's not the mom and pop you're doing business with. It's maybe somebody that got the information from an entity that you knew you were dealing with. And then your information got sold to that third party. And then that third party keeps selling your data. And I think more and more people are hearing about data brokers. One, because the federal government is entering into contracts and buying data from data brokers. And also that we hear about data breaches all the time. So I feel like everyone probably has received at least one data breach notification, whether that's from like your cable provider or your insurance company, or a store you are shopping online from, or a video game that your kids are signed up for. And so Vermont was the first one to create a transparent kind of registry that forces those entities to say that they're selling Vermonters data. And in this year, we're trying to make major updates to that because there's a lot of loopholes. There's a lot of companies not registering. There's not really an incentive necessarily for them to be transparent, and or they don't necessarily meet the definitions of what a data broker is right now. And so we're trying to kind of like clean that up. Last year, we also passed the age appropriate design code, the kids code, which really focused on really strong data privacy standards for kids that are generally using social media or a company like a website that's aimed at kids. So it's 50% or more of their kind of like online service is geared at kids' attention. Um, and so that also could fall into things like online gaming. Um, and that also just started to, something that we struggled with in that space is that it is the First Amendment tends to be weaponized against certain things when it comes to big tech. So we've had to kind of like figure out how to legislate in a way that big tech can be held accountable and doesn't necessarily slip through the cracks. And so that means we kind of go to war over constitutional issues, while everyone, like definitely wants to protect the First Amendment, at the same time, it can be used as kind of like against people in a way that companies will say, because the First Amendment isn't just what you say and you put out into the world, it's also information that you receive and that you're able to get access to. And so when it comes to harmful content to kids, that tends to be used as a way to not try to block access to certain things. We also did like phone free schools last year. What we're trying to work on this year is a comprehensive data privacy bill that we've been trying to do for the last, I think it was even predated me, but at least the 4 years I've been here, we've been trying to get that passed. Um, and that continues to be just basically a lobbying struggle with interests. So that's difficult, and we're not the only state having this fight, and it's very much in close contact with a lot of other people trying to work on the same thing, and we're still trying to get it across the line. Genetic data privacy, so protecting your DNA and your kids' DNA. Trying to do government information practices. So, what can the state government kind of transparency and accountability for what the state government has and who they can and can't share that information with, like the federal government. In particular, that was a big public concern in the past year. And then also working on an ed tech registry bill. Angela Arsenault, Rep. Arsenault, and Granning are working on kind of similar to the data broker bill, which is educational technology and like software used and apps used in schools. A lot of them are selling kids data to data brokers, and so or they might be doing other things that could be harmful, and so basically they're trying to push through an effort that ask in the very least starts to keep track of what are the software and apps that are being used in schools and which ones are completely safe and which ones are actually sharing children's data without them necessarily knowing that. um, and then there's been a whole slew of kind of artificial intelligence bills, people first, kind of like a chatbot companion bills, disclosure when you're talking to an AI, how AI is used in critical kind of decision making. So that's generally kind of the menu of topics that are there's more, but and I do wanted to take a few minutes, I'll pass it on, just to say that like we can't do any of these, largely fall under consumer protection, often under commerce and economic development, if not kind of some of the government IT committees. But because there is so much money in tech, artificial intelligence, anything to do with data, we just end up having a really unbalanced system in the state house of interests. And so just always want to take the time to encourage that if you walk away from this discussion today and you really want to get more involved in anything to do with the legislature and tech, data privacy legislation, I'm always happy to sit down and talk with people. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Monique. And it's great for you all to have connections with folks and to hear about their work so that you can be involved in different ways. I do think that sometimes the State House might seem like a scarier or inaccessible place. So just wanting to use the forums that we're creating as opportunities to make connections across state agencies, across our legislative leadership, across partners using data. And so many of you I can see who's in the room right now, the 44 of you who are joining us today. Many of you are data nerds like all of us on this call. So we're really excited to have you and we want to be able to make those connections. Thanks, Monique. All right, Julie, do you want to do your introduction next?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about this and the importance of data privacy as we work towards creating policies in Vermont that better help people meet their basic needs. So my name is Julie Lowell. I'm the Economic Security Policy and Outreach Director at Public Assets Institute. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that focuses on improving the well-being of all Vermonters and advancing racial, social, and economic justice. And in order to do that work, to inform it and ultimately influence these areas, we use research, fiscal analysis, and public engagement. And so in my role, I am thinking about how policy can make sure that everyone in Vermont can make ends meet through all of life stages, including Vermont's children and families. And so I use data regularly to evaluate how policies and programs are doing and how we can improve them. But I have to admit that as a data analyst, sometimes I am kind of more pulled towards analyzing the data and forming the conclusions from the data. And so this conversation about data collection and data privacy, sometimes it can feel a little bit mundane at times, or maybe just kind of overwhelming. And I don't know if Monique remembers, but the first time she and I talked about this topic, I was like, oh, this stuff's so boring. I know it's important. And so you are already on the call today. So maybe I don't have to pitch why this is so important to you, but I've got the floor for 5 more minutes, so I'm going to anyway. Um, so what really made this issue kind of pop for me in the last year is that I have been coordinating the Vermont Anti-Poverty Tax Credit Coalition over the past few years. And so that coalition has been working on expanding the value of refundable tax credits so that families with the lowest incomes get cash back when they file their taxes. We've been working on also increasing access to these credits. So we worked really hard to spread the word about these credits so that people will make sure to file their taxes and realize the benefits. In 2023, though, we were also successful in expanding access to Vermont's child tax credit and earned income tax credit to all residents in Vermont, both those with Social Security numbers and those with an ITIN number, an individual taxpayer identification number. This is a number that the IRS assigns to people living in the United States who aren't eligible for a Social Security number. And it's essential because the IRS requires all residents to pay taxes, regardless of their immigration status. Last year, then, the IRS, they broke decades of practice of keeping tax information confidential, specifically for people without this proper legal documentation. So the IRS entered into an MOU with the Department of Homeland Security to share this tax filer information, including addresses and other identifying information in batch record form. So this MOU is now in a big court battle that is continuing. But initially, the Department of Homeland Security asked for the records of up to 7 million people in the United States, and so far has shared about 47,000 taxpayers' records with the IRS has shared that information. Similarly, we've seen, and maybe this isn't news to all of you, hopefully a lot of you are already kind of aware of this, Medicaid records are similarly under assault. And so Vermont, along with 21 other states, they pushed back. They sued the federal government this summer when federal officials shared sensitive data about Medicaid recipients with the Department of Homeland Security. Again, this continues to be sort of held up in the courts. And in December, the courts ruled that Medicaid could share names, addresses, and other identifying info of those in the country illegally with the Department of Homeland Security from the states who brought the lawsuit. So it's still kind of unclear how this data is being separated out, and it continues to be an ongoing concern. And then, of course, here in Vermont, we've seen the feds coming to us to ask for more and more data. They've asked for this data outside of sort of the usual channels, the usual timeframes about recipients of SNAP and childcare assistance. And there's just not a lot of transparency about what data is being asked for, why, how the data is being shared, and what the process looks like at the state level to make that data sharing decision. So, as someone who's working on improving the well-being of everyone in our communities, this is deeply problematic. And Morgan already alluded to some of this, but I think there's some repetition for emphasis, right? Like this most recent data sharing is so concerning because it's being used to take people from our communities. And for those who are left here under similar circumstances, there's so much fear and trauma that's happening in their daily lives. But secondarily, if people aren't accessing needed services because they're afraid of their data being shared, they're losing out on resources to help their families make ends meet. And we aren't seeing this in practice across the country. According to a poll from KFF and the New York Times, nearly a third of adult immigrants reported skipping or putting off healthcare in 2025, a rise from a similar question asked in 2023. And this is true for other program access as well. From a more administrative perspective, as a researcher and policy advocate, we need this data to make informed policy and program recommendations. We need the data to help us evaluate the programs, how well and how poorly they're supporting people, which groups of people. And if people aren't willing to share their data, it's more difficult to assess who's being left out, why, and how we can make targeted challenges to improve access. Simply put, lack of data lessens the impacts of programs long term. And finally, sort of the last federal challenge we're facing right now is that there are increased federal eligibility restrictions on federally funded but Vermont administered programs, specifically Three Squares Vermont and Medicaid. And so as these restrictions are getting out, it's adding new layer of administrative burden on participants. So it's making it difficult for them to access needed benefits, even for those people who are still eligible for the programs. So what some states are starting to do in order to address this is pursue integrated data systems so that they can lessen the burden on participants and minimize benefit disruption. But in order to do that, states have to ensure the systems prioritize data security, privacy, and minimize personal details being shared or collected. So again, such a timely conversation. And all of a sudden, this issue of data privacy that had maybe seemed sort of mundane is no longer so, right? Although I would probably say it's no less overwhelming. So in this moment, the importance of data privacy, it's really clear. And of course, the example I gave of protecting immigrants in our community is just one example. We are all impacted by data privacy or lack thereof. And it's producing negative impacts, really compelling us to have this conversation today. So just before, as I close, I want to I've been trying to think about this in some question areas, and I open this up to workshop if these are the right buckets, but I've been sort of thinking of them in three ways, right? Data collection. We really need to have a good sense of what data is being collected and how is it shared, how is it protected, and what data rights do program participants have? And then the second bucket is oversight. As consumers of and advocates for state products, how and where can we find out more about what data is being collected and shared? And then finally, governance. Who is making these decisions about data? At the state level, do we have a unified data policy that protects us? And if not, how can we work towards creating one? So really excited to be with you here today, being part of this conversation, and just kind of want to repeat the importance of data as a through line in all of our work to improve the well-being of families and children in Vermont.
Thank you, Julie. It's amazing to hear the linkages just between the things that Monique is prioritizing and the legislature is thinking about related to how data is used in decision making and where there are challenges around data privacy, especially for young children, but then also the importance and the value of data collection and linking. And we'll talk a lot about that a little bit more in the panel discussion is how are we thinking about these topics as not just their own silo, but that they are all connected. Denise, I'd love to have you go next.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. So thank you for inviting me. I did want to warn right up front, if I start coughing and go on mute, you're on your own for a moment. I am the secretary for the Agency of Digital Services, but I also hold a second role in state government. I'm the state's chief information officer. So everything that Representative Priestley talked about and everything that Julie talked about are things that my agency, and we're an internal service agency, there's two, Agency of Administration and Agency of Digital Services. We're there to support our partners in state government, ultimately for Vermonters. And so I can give a quick overview so that you know who makes up my agency. But basically, we have just celebrated last Friday our 9-year anniversary as an agency, and in state government, that's very, very young. And we're the IT operations and advanced accessibility for state government. So my agency, we call ourselves ADS because we like to have acronyms for everything, but ADS provides the tech and the platforms that support all of the state agencies and departments, but ultimately help Vermonters access public services online. So we serve as that digital front door, digital support for the state. Um, our agency supports all executive branch departments and agencies along with the elected offices. So we don't support the two other branches as our day-to-day activity, but we do engage and try to work with them when it comes to things like governance and data and policies, which is really helpful for the Vermonters that we all serve. We have 5 divisions. One is our strategic programs division, which includes our enterprise architecture, business architecture, and our enterprise project management office. We have core enterprise services, which is something over the last few years we pulled together, which is the foundational services that every department and agency in state government uses and needs to use, including help desk, desktop support, our enterprise applications, and networking. Then we have our field enterprise services, which I think that we may tap into in some of the future conversations. These are the teams that support the specific environments that departments and agencies must use or need. So our Medicaid systems, our education systems, those are all supported and administered through our field enterprise services. Then we have our finance and business office, which is all our financials, procurement, contracting, and our vendor relationship management, and that matters. And I'll get back to that on the governance piece. And then our data and AI division. So Vermont, and very few people know this, but Vermont was the first state to hire a director of artificial intelligence. And we had legislature initiated a task force back in, I think it was 2017, 2018. That task force ended up resulting in the creation of this position and our AI council, which is made up of folks from both within government and outside of government. But the important part about that is that it became a very, very clear intersection around data and data privacy when that division was created, because we took data and we took this new AI concept and we merged them together, because you can't have artificial intelligence without data. But what we did, the very first action that the council worked with the division on, was we created a code of ethics. That code of ethics has been shared repeatedly across other states, and many other states across the US have adopted our framework for our code of ethics. They've put their own words on it, and some of them will admit that they use Vermont's model and some will not. And that is a kind of typical Southern states will not give kudos to us in the North, but that's okay. We know where it came from. But all of those divisions really focus on 4 key areas. And I feel like this is going to resonate with the group that we have here, because under my leadership, this agency, I'm the 3rd CIO that this agency has had. I spent 25 years in private sector tech. So I've had some good exposure into what happens out there, but also what are the different languages that private sector tech speaks versus what state government speaks. And there is a bit of a transition there. So what we're looking at for our key focus areas that should be repeatable across all of our agencies and departments is reducing complexity, because that really speaks to that availability of access to services and not making it so difficult and challenging all the time. Ensuring transparency and predictability. So I think I did hear from Julie too around knowing, what is this doing and where is that data and why is it there? We need to be able to ensure that everything that we're doing is built so that it's known without sacrificing privacy, ethics, and all of the confidentiality pieces for Vermonters specifically. Ensuring standards is another one. So we are really focused on applying those specific standards, whether or not it's NIST policy and framework or it's the data privacy standards. We've been working very closely with legislature on those data privacy bills and the language so that it can meet all of state government's needs, the same purpose that Monique was talking about before. And the last one is end user experience. So this is about building services with intention, ethics, and dignity. And I know that that's not something that you often hear state government talk about, but when we are dealing with so many agencies and departments, and each of them are looking at Vermonters uniquely in their own spaces, they're actually all supporting the same Vermonters. So we want to make sure that we don't get into situations that Julie had described where data is now under assault. I think I'm going to steal that, Julie, if that's okay. I do like that because I agree that it is a way of looking at things. And it's something that when you do things for the purpose of good, you forget that there's bad guys out there. And so we have to start building with the concept that there's bad guys out there and we need to protect the state's assets and the state's data privacy for residents in everything that we do, including building systems. So a couple of the things that we're focused on within the data and the AI division, that work is at the core of what we do. If it's digital, it's data. We haven't always called it data and data privacy within our ranks, and we also haven't looked at it historically, holistically. And now that we have an opportunity to, and we work closely with VASARA, and VASARA is the records management department within the Secretary of State's office, that's all about retention and records. But what we've done is brought a lot of focus over the past few years and the years ahead into the idea of accessibility, the idea of data privacy now and tomorrow, enforcing those retention policies, ensuring the data sharing agreements, ensuring that there's governance. And if there is not an applied framework to ensure that everybody's using at least that same standard so that they can make things more predictable and make things more available to the organizations that need to have it. But at the same time, if there's a data sharing agreement in place, I think one of the things that comes up often is what data am I giving and who am I giving it to? It's state data, even when it leaves the walls of state government. And if the retention policy of a particular department and agency is 2 years for that data, then that data sharing agreement needs to relay that because that accountability still sits with the receiving entity, that they would only be able to hold on to that for a portion of time. When we start looking at the public records law that's in place today, it hasn't really been modified to account for where we're at today in 2026, where everything is digital and everything is online. But even if we apply those foundational standards to it, at what point does data sharing of information become public record and public information? And where do you apply the retention policies? And that's where that's not a me conversation necessarily. It's a holistic conversation between the Attorney General's office, legislature, VASARA, and the Secretary of State's office, and the agencies. But it is a stakeholder discussion because as we're cleaning things up for the future, we've got to look a little bit backwards sometimes and start cleaning up some of the past too, so that we don't create some of those unintended consequences. And so as Julie, I loved, I mean, I took notes when you were talking because I loved it, a lot of what you said. The increased eligibility requirements absolutely plays a role. When we talk about system modernization, that doesn't mean that we put everything in one bucket and now everything is, and we love calling them data lakes or data warehouses or data lake houses. And just because you have a data warehouse doesn't mean that it all goes into one place, because that is not where we can ensure security. That's not where we can ensure the right levels of privacy. And so the integrated systems absolutely need to have those guardrails that I talked about in the standards and have the guardrails for be very intentional about what you're sharing. And if it has retention policy, then that data goes away. It has to go away. But whose responsibility is that? And that's one of those questions that we've been asking quite a bit in interfacing with the agencies and departments is once the data leaves your doorstep, whose responsibility in that oversight is it to ensure that everybody who you shared that data to has also discarded it if it's exceeded or extended its retention? So a lot of really great topics today, which I'm excited for all of the conversation, and I don't want to talk anymore because I'd love to be able to talk among all of the four of us here.
Thank you so much, Denise. The number of themes that are coming up from the three of you, but also the questions that are coming in from partners and colleagues, are really showing me that the questions that we're asking as a state are the right ones, and that there isn't an easy answer necessarily. It really is discussion based. So we're going to pin Julie and Monique to our panel, and then I'm going to unpin myself because I'm not sure how many we can pin at the same time. Let's see if we can do one more. Here we go. All right. So, in terms of the roundtable discussion, really excited to have all three of you really dive in and talk amongst yourselves around five key questions. We may or may not get to all of them, and there's so many that have come in as well. So, I'm not going to call on you. I'm going to ask the question and then really allow you to talk amongst each other and also ask each other questions around these topics for what we don't know. And the other thing I want to ask of you is dispel any myths. There's a lot of things that partners don't know. And just the four of us on a call a couple of weeks ago to prep, we're like, oh, wow, we didn't realize that X, Y, and Z were in place or we had this protection. So really call out things that you've heard asked or any of the myths there. So I want to start by zooming way out. Right back at the beginning, we always collect data to understand systems of service. We understand where data can be such an important tool to understand outcomes for kids and that it can be harmful. And so think a little bit about and talk amongst yourselves around how each of you are thinking about the tension in your work right now. Data is so valuable and important, but there's so many trade-offs, and you've named some of the biggest challenges to data privacy. How are you thinking about that in this moment?
I just unmuted, so if it's okay, I'll go first. Um, in order to be intentional about what we do, the first place I always go is from a personal standpoint. I am a mother of four, and I am somebody who has spent now over 25 years in tech. If you and nobody asked me this, which is really interesting. No one asked me, what are your kids allowed to do? What are your kids allowed to have? How do you do this? I don't sign those permission slips many times. My kids have very limited access to social media, and they have to read at a certain age, 16. So my youngest is 12, almost 13, and she does not have any social media, nor does she have any devices, nor will she have a device. So I think about that first is, well, why am I doing that? And I'm doing that because I know what's going to happen, and I know why those challenges exist. So how do I apply that then into the work that we do? And it's not easy. These are not easy answers because there are requirements and obligations. And when we receive federal dollars, there's a contract, there's an agreement that the state signs with that federal agency on why we are accepting the data, what are the responsibilities of, I mean, that funding, sorry, the responsibilities of that funding, and where does data play a role? And in some cases, we are sending that and have been for decades to the same entities, not thinking about what if they shared it with somebody else. And so this is relatively new within the last year or so, where if we're not allowed to share it with anybody else, we've made the assumption that that department isn't allowed to either. And um, that's I think where that assault comment comes in, Julie, maybe is that we now do have to think like that. And so it has to be a reciprocal sharing, not just a one-way sharing consideration. But when it comes to private information, sensitive information, we need to err 100% on the side of caution. But there needs to be a blend between state responsibilities and personal responsibilities too.
Kelly, I don't want to race you if you want to jump in. I think so. And Morgan, can you give just a just a quick like who's on the call as far as populations? I just wanna. I think I have a good idea, but
Sure. So we have legislators, we have data nerds, people who are managing data for nonprofits, for
cool.
advocacy organizations. There could be, I mean, it could be a range of folks,
Okay,
people
cool.
doing
Okay,
direct service, everybody.
cool. I'll try to keep. I don't want to go too data nerdy, but um, I think so. I think a tension that I've seen, especially like I'll just talk about the comprehensive data privacy bill as an example of something that affects a lot of, if not everybody on this call. And it's been something I actually had. So also similarly, my whole career has been in tech since I was in high school, and then now the legislature. And there was definitely a period. I did so much of that was in software management, kind of like product management, and just being go between on like with customer service and onboarding people who were not technically minded onto into software environments, and then also doing things like customer support with elderly individuals, or also doing small business planning classes with nonprofits and people. And I did a ton of like, if you want to be found on the internet, you have to have a Facebook page, you have to have a Google My Business, you have to have all these things. And now you would have a website. I would build the websites. And now doing all the data privacy bill, I'm like, oh my God, that's actually terrifying. I wish I knew what I knew now. And I think like part of that I'm saying is that like we are expected at all times to be giving up all our data. We're expected to collect it. I had a nonprofit for a decade. I had cases where my board members were like, throw the donor information on Google Sheets, and then we'll all see it, and we can help with writing thank you letters and reaching out to them for money and things like that. And it was just like a lot of things where it's like we never had discussions about data privacy at the time. Like, luckily, at the moment we had that meeting, I was like, actually, I'm working on a data privacy bill, and there's no way that I'm putting this on a Google Sheet to share with all of you. But there's I worked for 6 months last year. People had hired me to learn what it looks like to build a privacy program from the inside of a business, so I could understand the struggles and the conversations that businesses were having. And probably a lot of you are super familiar with doing that from scratch, and not having that as a resource. And how do you even start that? And I mean, the first things that I had to go through as becoming a contractor were all of the training videos on data privacy that are kind of just like in the box, and I just watched them. And the number of times where it's like, oh my God, this is why we should be concerned. This is why businesses should be concerned, talking about things like who in the company has access to data that they shouldn't have, where is the data stored, um, is the company prepared for a data breach? We talk about exempting nonprofits and small businesses from our data privacy bill. Often that starts at like 35, the data of 35,000 Vermonters or more. And thinking through this training I was going through, I was like, wait a second, if a Vermont organization has 20,000 records, and the average fine of per record of a data breach for a company is $160, then if that company with 20,000 records in Vermont gets breached, they're looking at potentially a $3.2 million fine. Like, most small businesses I know and nonprofits would be, that's not even a number they can comprehend having access to. And so that was the moment where I was like, we we need to, like people, we already have data breach laws in Vermont. We're already like all of our organizations and businesses, like I said, had both small businesses and nonprofits, and like everyone is at risk and liable for holding onto data. And in some cases, I've had conversations where nonprofits and things are like, I have 20 years of data and it's valuable and I can't let go of that data. And I'm like, at this point, I'm like, wait a second, like, are those people still even alive? Especially in Vermont. We have an old aging population, but just I think that at some point, everyone has to start having conversations about whether or not the data they're collecting they actually need, and they actually need like things like names attached. I definitely have felt that like applying for federal grants, needing to have genders and ages and ethnicity and income and all that kind of stuff. It is highly sensitive if that's getting leaked out to data brokers that are building people's profiles on who they are from a really early age, again, and their families. So I think like we are forced in the nonprofit world, small business world, to store all this data and collect all this data in order to apply for grants. But then it's also, we're at risk and we're actually liable if we're not protecting that. We're never told that. And so I think like this is a great opportunity to think about like how actually can we all support each other in Vermont to think more responsibly, make sure we're not asking each other for data that is going to put us at risk, and thinking about the risks that we are putting our families and the kids at if we're asking them for certain information and holding on to it indefinitely and storing it in a Google Drive. Um,
I think it's incredibly important, Monique, for the group that's on today to be hearing a lot about the partnership aspect and that it's not a gotcha moment, right? We're actually talking about trying to figure out what is the least restrictive data that we can capture on behalf of kids and families that we actually need to ensure service access, to ensure understanding of gaps, to really think about who has access to what and to ensure equitable access versus some of the other ways that data are used. And a lot of folks on this call, whether they realize it or not, have requirements to collect information on behalf of kids and families and send it to the state. And there's often a black box in what that looks like. So I think it's really important for them to hear you all talk a little bit about how you're thinking in that area. So I really appreciate that. Julie.
I thought I can add a slightly different or additional perspective. And just kind of summarize what Denise and Monique said is like, this really does truly call for a systems response. Like there is so much to understand in this arena, and so few of folks who run nonprofits and businesses understand it to this degree. So really glad to have this as a larger community conversation and know it really does need a systems response. But one other, I'm not a data collector, I'm a data user and often thinking about policy and programs. And so I've been really encouraged over the past 5 years about how inclusive Vermont has made a lot of our social safety net programs. And so an important part of this conversation, I think, is thinking about how we can expand data collection in ways that are safer. And so some of that might be a little turning more or to qualitative data. And so thinking about how we talk with communities more and more about how in completely confidential ways about how data is being, or how programs are impacting them, what they need in this moment. Because while we want to encourage people and still make programs as we are able to accessible to them in our safety net, what all the other alternatives can the state also spin up. So I think back to during the pandemic, we had the economic impact payments that came from the federal government. And a lot of Vermont residents weren't eligible for them because they didn't have the proper documentation. And so state lawmakers, they did the economic equity payments. And so they were able to get cash resources to folks who didn't qualify for the federal impact payments, but they did it through a local organization and used that venue to get people resources in a way that felt really safe and secure and were able to talk frankly with communities about what level of data can we collect, et cetera, and where is that stored. So just think there's an opportunity right now to think about alternate ways, including qualitative ways that we can partner with data and expand safety net programs to meet the needs of folks in our community.
Thanks, Jolie. A couple of themes that just came up across the three of you was one, how funding plays a role in data and how we think about what data we're sharing. And so I'm going to actually merge two of the questions that we talked about earlier in our prep call. And so we talked a lot about how important it is to have data and to potentially link data and to think about data differently. We also talked about, the 1970s era Vermont public records laws and how should we be thinking about our current frameworks for data, but in a context of a different federal or national environment around data access. And so, how are we sitting with that tension? And we've talked a little bit about, what data we're required to share with whom and under what circumstances. But I'd love for the three of you to reflect on that piece a little bit more and how funding plays a role in what we are required to report, whether it's at the federal level or it's our private nonprofit or small businesses who are required to report to the state. Like, how do we balance um, that tension of our existing frameworks with what we're actually asking of folks to be sharing?
I always seem to jump in and unmute first because if we're comfortable right now in this conversation, then we're not doing it right. We've got to start feeling comfortable being uncomfortable. And the reason why I say that is from federal funded programs, what we send and who we send it to is so directly tied to what we're getting for funding and how we are dispersing it. And when it comes to the programs that I know this organization plays a very strong role in, there is a lot of information that is contractually obligated between either the department or the agency and the federal government that is sent monthly and has been for decades. And if we want to choose no longer to accept those federal dollars, can the state pick up the cost on those? And those are questions well above my position. But when it comes to the tech and the data, it's difficult. And the one thing that I think that we forget to do sometimes is continue re-asking, continue reevaluating. If we've been sending it for 15 years because the programs have been in place for 15 years, have we stopped to think about, could we do it different? Should we do it different? Should we require attestations to the federal government? Should we be requiring something back of them? Just because we get the money doesn't mean they get to make all the rules to the game. So there has to be some maturity to our partnership with the state government, I mean, with the federal government and the state, but also that stakeholder group collaboration is really, really critical. And we have to stop pressing the button because we came in every day to press the button. We have to start asking, why are we pressing that button?
Um, yeah, I think it's also like in addition to all of us questioning kind of the role that all the organizations have and who's asking for data and how we're protecting and all that kind of stuff and what funding that makes us have access to. I think from a legislative perspective, I am, Morgan, you were saying the like really old public record laws. Like when I talk to constituents who have moved here from foreign countries, especially EU countries, they're just horrified at the fact that everything they do, their voting record, their land records, everything is public record, and they don't really, in a lot of cases, they don't have an option, even if they are in like dangerous situations, and being stalked and things like that. There's some programs they can get into, but and so I think it's just like I think we need to be thinking about as a nonprofit. Like when I was having forums, like, do I really need the information, this field that I'm going to ask people for, even though I'm asking for sensitive information, in order to gets survey data for a grant, it's like thinking about like, do I actually truly need this information? And I think, or do I need to keep it in the same spot with the person's name and their other contact information? Can I store it in another way? So I think in public records, like I think there is room to take. It's like very much an American thing. So that is like it's such a bigger question. But I do wonder if we need to think about what we actually force the public to share, and how we're storing that, and how and what we're doing it with it. I also think we just need to like. There's so many situations where uh, systems a lot through people kind of freaking out about the comprehensive data privacy bill of about restrictions, especially with nonprofits. Some of the stories I've been hearing about how they need to fill out because for whatever reason, either state or federal systems like software systems not working, and they need to like fill something out on paper, scan it to their computer. It's on an employee's like computer, but then they're like either manually calling or hand entering themselves somewhere into state and government and the federal systems. And like that, like they shouldn't need to do that. So but they don't want to make, in those cases, they don't want to testify because they don't want to get in trouble and or they don't want to lose their funding because they don't want to be the squeaky wheel that's like, I have to stop making me jump through these weird loophole, like these weird hula hoops to get access to the funding, or to give my the families that need the funding, to give the family the funding. And so I think somehow we also need to like, if there isn't already a safe space, actually, this is something I would love from this community later. Safe space call. Please feel free to reach out. I really would love to hear the stories from people who are struggling with certain systems, feeling like they're in that crunch of like, I need to enter this thing, but the system is broken and I can't raise the alarm. Otherwise, I won't get I'm like putting my families at risk. That's the kind of stuff that we have to figure out how to talk about, because it is putting the families at risk. It is also putting the employee at risk, and it's also putting the organization at risk. And so if it's state and federal systems that are putting people on that bind, then we have to do something about it. And that's, yeah. And I know, like, Denise, I know you have to like you have to figure that out. So I'm sure you want to know all of those systems as well, and want people to be able to say that too. So
That was actually what I was going to say. I was going to unmute when you were finished speaking because I want to know about those systems too. Email me directly. I read all my emails. I may not read them as timely as I would like to, but I do read them and I action them too. So, Monique, I guess I'll even ask, would you want to work on that together? Because I absolutely want to know the system,
yeah,
and it may be something that my team isn't aware of. Because,
yeah,
like
no,
I
for sure.
said, it's 35 years old or 60 years old, God forbid, in some areas,
Yeah,
that they didn't know that data was there, or they didn't know it was so difficult because it wasn't until I joined the state 3 years ago that we finally said end user experience. So
yeah,
when we put a system out there, it has to be for Vermonters, not for the people clicking on a keyboard. So I would be happy to hear that direct as well and work
yeah.
with them.
I don't think I have to add very much to this one, but excited to like hear this and just continue to think about an understanding for like the user of what data is out there, what data is being shared. I think that, as an advocate who's been trying to follow this for the last year, I think that could also add to this conversation of what are those data sets that have been shared for 15 years that we don't know about or aren't thinking of, and where can we look at them? And because then I think you can get a lot of knowledge from a lot of different players on like, well, that's not super necessary, is it? Or that's actually a really dangerous field and no one ever thought about it. And it would have been great if Tracy Dolan could have joined us today because she has a great lens from I always get her department's name wrong, but the refugee perspective in terms of what data the state has really thought carefully about, what's safe to collect and what's not. So it feels like as much as we can invite people into this conversation, the better.
I'm not sure whether or not Kaya is on the call. I don't see her in the moment, but I want to bring something to the three of you because I've heard at least Julie and Monique talk about qualitative data or asking about experience versus the number of something. And so I want to hear the three of you talk a little bit about both the importance, the value, and how challenging it can be to think about capturing information from individuals across a range of different populations and where it's so important to understand the lived experience perspective versus solely capturing the number of something or the amount of times of X, but actually understanding a little bit more about that. And how do you think about that data? How do you talk about qualitative data?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. I mean, first, what comes to mind for me is like it really requires some investment of resources because in order to get good qualitative data, you have to build strong and trust relationships. And so maybe that's with participants who are using the program, but it might be with organizations that are already embedded in the community that are trusted by folks in the community. And so it's just such a different process than spinning up a form that people have to fill out, but it really takes time and conversation. And I think the state has some really good resources already in place that could be pulled upon, recognizing that like capacity is always a challenge, and which is why I say we really need the investment, right? We do have the Office of Racial Equity that's doing some amazing work. Um, there was another one that just slipped my mind. We've we have some organizations in Vermont that are doing a lot of really good translation work and things like that. So we have some models to turn to, and we can always be doing more. And we would really, I think, need to grow some of those programs that already exist.
Thanks, Julie. I'm thinking specifically
So
about suppression, right? And how we don't necessarily have the ability to capture and share information on the true experience of population. So please think about and reflect on that as well. Like how do we understand experience if we can't actually do a deeper dive into some subpopulations as well? Go ahead, Julie.
I feel like the Department of Health has some really great models that they've used, particularly during COVID as well, that we could learn from and talk to. And I'm just not up on their day-to-day workings, right? But I think they're doing a lot of building community trust and support and having these conversations.
Yeah, Morgan, sorry, this isn't a world I know other than having to have kept qualitative data. And it was the main thing that differentiated. I feel like in grant applications, you have to do it. I think somebody brought up an interesting thing. I was actually talking to a nonprofit consultant, data privacy consultant the other day, and she advises nonprofits on, the whole data protection and what they're collecting and does actually a lot of activities of like what are you collecting and why are you collecting it and how are you keeping it and that kind of stuff. And the number of things she was talking about when it comes to qualitative, whether it's both the clients, like families, the kids, or it's the donors in any of these databases having notes on the stories that a kid might walk in from a family situation that might be not great at home, or it could be like recent deaths in the family that the kid needs to help kind of adjusting to, or specific needs that they have, and or if it's a donor, it's like this person has ability to give because they just lost their grandmother, who was like a major has a major trust or something. But thinking about like we all need that type of data to be able to like tell the stories and do the work and support the people, and in some cases to make the connections and the right timing on things. But she very much brought it back to like, imagine if those systems got breached. You now shared that a person in the family died. You shared that there might be alcoholism in somebody's family, and that they might, later that in a breach that could be sold and accessed by insurance companies that then know that there's alcoholism that runs in the family that might not have been disclosed, and that might make your insurance rate go up. Like certain things that like thinking about the amount of information that is collected and what the ramifications of how that data could be used in the future is also just something to really be mindful of.
So I promised myself I wouldn't get too technical, and I can go very technical in this conversation because When we look at the work that we do with our partners in state government and their partners as well, and ultimately for Vermonters, one of the things that we do is we look at it from a life cycle standpoint. And I don't think government inherently does that to say, let's enter this as a life cycle. But when we start talking about qualitative data, we have to look at the life cycle. And so um, that going back to that, if you're comfortable, you're doing it wrong. We are very comfortable in systems because they've always been around and we've just collected touch points. There's text, there's data, there's information, but we've never driven it back to outcomes. And so if we are looking at it from a technology standpoint, we need to make sure that the information and the data that we're collecting is tied to the outcome. Is it mission driven? And if it's not mission driven, why are we collecting it? We're just collecting. And now we're a data collector. Like it's on my shelf everywhere and it looks pretty and it's great, but it's absolutely serving no purpose other than dust. And so if we don't tie it to, again, intent and outcome, and this is where the ethics and trust conversation comes in, that's kind of my lens on the qualitative piece. Then why are we collecting it? Because we get into this anecdotal drift and we do this collection for the sake of collection, but there's no purpose driven behind it. And that's when we start having those unintentional consequences. And that does require a shift. It requires an operational shift. It requires changing how we do things, and it requires us to think critically, something that technology and AI can't replace for us. But it is something that we have to be okay with acknowledging when we shouldn't be collecting it anymore, or when we're not fully represented. And fully representing a group doesn't mean collect more data. Go back to the mission. What's the objective and the outcome? And then at what point in time does it have a timestamp? It's a cycle, right? And so we've started naming those steps in the cycle when it comes to technology so that we can hit all of our partners in state government and their objectives and their goals and their intents along the way. And Monique, of all people, knows because she gets to see me all the time in testimony, depending on what committee it is. Why are we doing this? How is it going? And the why piece isn't my why necessarily. It's a bigger why. It goes well beyond me, but we have to be okay with saying we're not meeting that why anymore. We have to shift. We have to make a change, and it has to be an intentional change. So from a tech standpoint, maybe not a data science piece, if we can't tie the collection to outcome, then we have to question whether or not we should still be collecting.
I appreciate you talking about it as a life cycle, especially because we're in a room full of early childhood partners who are really trying to understand how we are impacting a child's long-term growth and development, right? And so the last question or the last discussion prompt for you all is around how we think about the trajectory of a child's life and the data and the life cycle of the data alongside the life cycle of a human, right? We, for a very long time as a state, have said, okay, we want to have a better picture of this child's outcomes and their trajectory. What did they have access to? How did that impact how they were doing at different points in time? And can we understand where the system is really supporting those outcomes or where we have gaps, right? And so we've talked about trajectories, we've talked about linking data systems, and we have so many agencies, departments, and divisions that are collecting information from our communities and from families. And so, I guess the question is from that data governance lens, from that, who gets to decide and how do we do this well? Who has decision-making authority over linking? How should we as a state be thinking about where it's important and valuable and where it could be potentially harmful to link data to truly understand trajectories or understand how systems are impacting each other? And it brings up that question, Julie, that you asked around where there's standard policy guidance around state data practices. But just any reflections you have on when you think it's really important and valuable to think about linking, to think about trajectories, and how we should be thinking about that as a state from that decision-making authority perspective. And Who's responsible?
I'll unmute first. Um, that's a big question. That is a question that doesn't have one single answer to it. And I think that you can tell from this panel that ultimately the answer is there's a stakeholder group. And I'm going to have folks that are just going to disagree with that, both folks that are my peers and folks that are other stakeholders. And the reason being is that depending on the program, there are different responsibilities with folks who are accountable to run that program. And so you will find that CDD or AOE or whatever uh, named agency, they're the ultimate ones responsible and accountable to a program and the viability and the success of that program. But they don't do it alone. They have their stakeholder groups. And so if the stakeholder group is too small, we may miss opportunities. If the stakeholder group is right sized, then we've got the right voices at the table. But I don't think it's always going to be a consensus either. When it comes to my agency, the authority that I have is we have state data governance processes and standards, not policy. So policy is not set by my agency. Policy is set by legislature. It's set by the Attorney General's office sometimes. And internal operational state policy is set by the agency of administration. So it just goes to maybe it's a term of words, but if there's a standard, who's not following the standard? How do we ensure that they do follow the standard? And what was the exception to not allow them to? But I guess that answer is there's no easy answer to that. And it really varies by flavor and program. But ultimately, you will find somebody who is responsible and accountable to the program, which ultimately would mean that they would be the one entity that um, can sign off on success or failure.
I don't think this will come as a surprise by answer, right? But I think the value in this is clearly lessening burden, and so that people can access their benefits more easily. And we've all seen that. I think in our personal lives, everything is very easy to it's always very easy to spend money or to access certain things. And so how can we harness that technology in a way that people can get the benefits that their family qualifies for in an easy, straightforward way that isn't feeling super overwhelming and daunting. But again, this is why it's so important to have so many voices at the table and those partnerships and stakeholders, because I don't know the tech end of that as well, right? I don't know all the kind of different safeties and securities and protocols, but Denise and Monique, I think, do have that knowledge. And so it's exciting to be here in conversation about this together, because I maybe falsely so assume that there are more safeguards that can be put in place to do this in a way that that really does protect people and their details, their privacy.
Yeah, and I think we covered a lot of this, so I won't. But maybe just reiterating that, like as Denise said, like thinking about the actually like how long do we need data and revisiting that at all times is so important. Like I said, the few examples I gave of elements that might be on a 5-year-old's record when they did summer camp or an after school program, and then nobody thought about deleting the record, and it carries through high school, potentially, maybe even college, depending on the state systems, and maybe they're adults and that record is still out there that disclose information that they maybe would never give as an adult. And so, yeah, I think like it's in some ways, do we not only do we check in that we still need the record, but do we give the human we're collecting the data from agency to say, like, in one case, we might say, we need your data, otherwise you're not getting benefits. But if we're holding on to that data, even after they need benefits, is that fair to the person without checking in on them? So I think asking those questions, not only is it needed for the entity, but is it harming and or still beneficial to the human.
Thank you all. I'm going to ask my team to unpin each of us and then invite the broader group that's with us to be in a question and answer period. We do have a list of questions that have come in that I'll bring to you. And as we're transitioning into that, one of the first ones that I want to name is based on what Monique was just talking about, which is the retention schedule and how we know who has access to what for how long. And so one of the questions that came through is where can partner organizations, those who are non-state agencies that are working with data, working with state data, get guidance on? Like where should we all be looking for guidance on retention schedules and how to do this data work really well?
So one of the places that you can go to generically, if you want to know about more than one department or agency, is Vasara. And I believe there is a direct number and email address. I'll see if I can pull it up while we are um, online here. The other is to ask the department specifically because the retention schedule may be tied to the program itself, depending on what the federal guidelines or federal requirements are if it was a federally funded program. So agencies and departments are responsible for their own retention policies, and their systems would need to adhere to those policies as well. And that asking the question, I think, is so important. And asking it if you know who the director is, if you know who's running the program, if it's the secretary's office. This isn't a public records request type of discussion. This is really a programmatic and department leadership question. That was where I would start. Thank you, Dora.
Morgan, I would just add that there's because again, because like data privacy, one, there's laws happening in every state here and there, the ones that can pass them. But also because I mean, there's cases where company like nonprofits and stuff might have cyber insurance. But there's been starting to be cases where cyber insurance claims are denied because the entity that was trying to use it wasn't protecting their data. I'm not saying this to scare people. I'm saying this to like, I think there is a world in which there should start to be, and hopefully will start to be, justification for entities to start getting, grants and money that they can actually hire. I think in a lot of cases, like it feeds into legal liability and risk, and so getting access to whether it's like reaching out to Common Good Vermont, if any of the the nonprofits on the call may or may not have access to the state resources, and or there's like lots of nonprofit privacy consultants that are starting up, and or have been in business for a while all over the country. I'm actually doing a webinar with somebody on Wednesday from 12 to 1. It's free, but I think that if you haven't already started thinking about this, I think it's the time to start at least getting some kind of like audit or somebody to talk you through the questions to ask.
I appreciate that. And I'm thinking about some of the resources that you all have pointed to, but also that in the chat there have been resources shared. So that's something that my team can work to compile and put out when we do the summary of grand rounds. But also the invitation is out there that if there are other resources like that folks want to share and be connected to, please put those in the chat. Also, open invitation to turn your cameras on. No requirement to do that, but feel free to turn your cameras on. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And until I see hands, I'll keep going through the list of questions that have already been submitted. Because we're talking a little bit about resources for organizations, one of the other questions that came through is what are some of the tools and resources that are available to early childhood programs that could help with either data storage or ensuring data security? And would those be any different from some of the, retention schedules and support that our agencies or common good could provide?
That's not something I am as familiar with, but I can definitely take a note and provide information back to you, Morgan, that you can disseminate with the attendees.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this one's an interesting one, right? Because we have so many partners in the early childhood community that we are requiring to capture information from families. We all know, actually, I should not say that. Several folks on the call know how antiquated our data systems are in the state of Vermont, right? Our data systems are old and can be really challenging. And I think what this points to is a question of if our state agencies' data systems are challenging, what do our on the ground data systems and the folks that are capturing information on behalf of kids and families to then feed into those entities? What do those look like? And how should we be thinking about supporting those entities who, again, are actually not the ones who we think of as typical data nerds, data stewards, even though, right, they're the direct service providers who are capturing information on behalf of children and families and are serving as this go-between. So I think that that's something that we can be thinking about a little bit more. Going back to one of the primary questions of the day around data privacy and populations, the last question I want to put out there is how do you think we should all be thinking about collecting demographic information on behalf of Vermonters while protecting people's privacy, especially in rural areas of the state and for our historically marginalized populations? How would you be thinking about demographic data collection before we wrap up?
From a technology standpoint, my preference would be that it is collected outside of the service system and that it's not collected alongside the PII of the individual or their family. But that's my preference. I'm giving you my personal CIO hat preference. I know that that's not the reality, but what we do a lot of the time, especially working with the Office of Racial Equity and the other um, uh, advisory and support offices for some of those marginalized populations, is we're going back and de-identifying it after the fact. And the reality is again going back to qualitative data and outcomes. If we're collecting it for a, a more generalized view, then we shouldn't be collecting it from within the system itself.
Any other thoughts around demographic data collection?
Objective and outcome, which Denise, I just wanted to highlight it again because I think that's really important. And again, including stakeholders into thinking about, are these demographic details important for us to collect? Who are the organizations on the ground working with certain populations that would like to be able to get to a point where there's some disaggregated data based on race or gender or some of these identifiers, and recognizing it's going to change over time, right? But let's have everybody be a part of the conversation so that folks can have the option. And I think that kind of leads me to another thought around, giving people options, but also the opt-out as I think already exists in a lot of our demographic data, but that continues to be really important, that people don't have to share any of those pieces.
Thank you. All right. Well, I want to give very a very strong thank you to our three panelists for this roundtable. I think that, again, data is not the most fun and sexy thing for all of our partners. We all love to talk about it as a part of our everyday lives, but I really appreciate you bringing in examples and making it real for folks to understand how you're thinking about data and what is possible for how we should be thinking about data in the future. I know there's a ton of resources from partners at Common Good in the chat. Again, we'll compile and be sharing out the notes and any resources for folks after today's convening. We're also going to be continuing this conversation at our Data and Evaluation Committee and some of our other strategic plan committees opportunities for folks who are interested. And you all heard our agency leadership alongside our legislative leadership say, reach out to us. We want to hear from you around how things are working, what's not working, what are the ways that we should be thinking about data. So really appreciate the connections there as well. And we will follow up with a recording, the recap, and all of the resources, as well as the contact information for our panelists later this week. So thank you all for being here for Early Childhood Grand Rounds. Have a good rest of your week.